Before you drift into sleep tonight, let me take you somewhere humanity was never meant to go. Because the world you live in, the cities, the borders, the governments, the technology, exists only because of a gamble our ancestors made 9,000 years ago. A gamble they didn't understand, a gamble they almost lost, and a gamble that locked every single one of us into a system we can never escape. Tonight, you're not just going to hear history. You're going to witness the moment everything changed. Imagine a world where humans lived taller, stronger, healthier, freer than we do now. No kings, no taxes, no wars over land, no cities choking in disease. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity lived this way, moving with the seasons, eating dozens of foods, living in equality and balance with nature. Then came a drought, a terrible, unpredictable, civilization-ending drought that pushed a few desperate communities to try something dangerous: farming. Planting seeds wasn't progress, it was survival. But the moment they did it, the trap snapped shut. Their bodies shrank, their bones weakened, their teeth rotted. Violence exploded. Inequality appeared. Entire landscapes were destroyed. And yet, it worked just well enough to keep them alive. Not happy, not healthy, but alive. And then something terrifying happened. Populations grew, too large to ever return to the way things were. Every generation became more dependent on this fragile system. More fields, more irrigation, more labor, more war, more hierarchy, more suffering. Until finally agriculture didn't just support society, it became society. The cities rose, the kings appeared, the armies marched, and the world as we know it began. But here's the twist: agriculture was never inevitable. Some cultures rejected it completely and lived better lives for thousands of years. And if the drought had lasted just a little longer, humanity might have taken a completely different path. Healthier, freer, more equal, but smaller. Tonight, we're going to explore the story no one ever told you: the rise of civilization as the greatest trap in human history. How we got locked into it, why we can never go back, and what it means for our future. So settle in, take a breath, because once you hear this story, you will never look at human history or your own life the same way again.
For nearly 300,000 years, long before anyone imagined villages, kings, fields, or wheat, human beings lived in a world shaped not by walls or boundaries, but by movement, memory, and the rhythms of nature. This was the final long chapter of our species' pure hunter-gatherer existence. And although modern imagination often paints it as harsh or primitive, the archaeological and biological evidence tells a very different story. Life was not effortless, but it was balanced, sustainable, and deeply suited to the bodies and minds that evolution had shaped over countless generations. In this world, people lived in small bands, often 30 to 50 individuals, moving through landscapes they knew with exquisite precision. They followed seasonal resources, shifting from river valleys to upland forests, from coastal shallows to plains alive with wild game. Their diets, drawn from hundreds of plants, nuts, fruits, roots, and animals, provided an extraordinary nutritional range. Their teeth were intact, their bones strong, their immune systems resilient. Their average adult height matched or exceeded that of many modern populations, and they rarely suffered from the chronic diseases that later plagued farming societies, such as tooth decay, anemia, or repetitive strain injuries from grinding grain. Work, too, looked nothing like the relentless toil of later eras. Hunter-gatherers typically spent around 12 to 20 hours a week on subsistence activities. The rest of their time belonged to conversation, child-rearing, tool-making, storytelling, ritual, rest, and play. Because mobility prevented the accumulation of unnecessary possessions, these societies lived with an ease of movement that produced an unusual form of freedom. Nothing tied them down except the land itself, and the land was generous as long as it was treated with respect and understanding. This world was also profoundly egalitarian. Without stored wealth, there was little that could be hoarded or stolen. Without permanent houses or fields, there were no fixed boundaries to fight over. Leadership was fluid, based on experience or situational skill rather than coercive authority. A skilled tracker might lead during a hunt, a wise elder during negotiations, a gifted storyteller during evening gatherings, but none held permanent power. Sharing was not charity, it was survival. When a hunter killed a large animal, the meat was distributed equally because no family could preserve it alone. When a gatherer found an abundant patch of berries, everyone came to harvest. Such practices created cultures built around cooperation and reciprocity rather than competition or domination. Even social tensions were managed differently. Conflicts did arise, but without property or hierarchy, they rarely escalated into the kind of violence that later became common. People could simply move away, joining a neighboring group or shifting their territory slightly. The landscape was open, unbounded, and abundant enough for such flexibility. Spiritually and psychologically, too, hunter-gatherers lived in a world of depth and connection. They understood animal behavior intricately, followed weather patterns with an intuitive grasp, and recognized plants with a precision few modern botanists could match. Their oral traditions preserved knowledge across generations with astonishing fidelity. Stories about migration routes, wind patterns, flood cycles, medicinal plants, and moral lessons woven together into richly symbolic narratives. Tools in this era, though simple by later standards, were marvels of refined design. Blades were pressure-flaked into shapes optimized for cutting efficiency. Bone needles pierced hides with ease, enabling clothing suited to Ice Age winters. Spears, atlets, baskets, nets, and traps demonstrated deep technological ingenuity, shaped by necessity and long observation. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a use. Everything had meaning. And because mobility limited possessions, tools themselves were light, elegant, and multifunctional. Social lives were equally rich. Bands were embedded in wider networks through marriage exchange, seasonal gatherings, rituals, and shared ancestry stories. These networks allowed people to trade knowledge, tools, pigments, shells, and even genetic diversity. They also acted as a safety net. If one area suffered a temporary resource decline, neighboring groups could offer support. This interconnectedness is one of the reasons hunter-gatherer societies remained remarkably stable across thousands of generations. Their world was also shaped by a deep sense of time. Without written records, they relied on memory, but memory was collective, distributed, and reinforced through story, dance, song, and ceremony. Through these practices, people carried in their minds maps of their territories extending over hundreds of miles, as well as knowledge of where animals migrated, where edible roots grew in dry seasons, where water lingered in hidden rock basins long after rivers dried up. Their intelligence was not theoretical, but lived, embodied knowledge, precise, adaptive, and impossible to replicate without living the same way. Health in these societies, contrary to modern stereotypes, was remarkably strong. Infectious diseases were rare because populations were small and mobile. Epidemics could not take hold when groups moved frequently and interacted in limited ways. Chronic malnutrition was uncommon because diets were diverse. Even childbirth, though dangerous everywhere before modern medicine, was supported by experienced midwives and communal knowledge. Injuries occurred, but people rested, healed, and continued. Their bones show few signs of repetitive labor or wear. Their teeth show minimal decay. Their stature indicates robust growth. All of this paints a picture of a world not idyllic, but deeply suited to human life. Freedom of movement, abundant knowledge, flexible social structures, and shared survival created a way of life that endured, essentially unchanged, for hundreds of millennia. And then, slowly, subtly, unnoticeably at first, something shifted. People in a few regions, especially in the Levant, began staying in one place longer, returning season after season to favored patches of wild grain. They built slightly sturdier shelters. They stored seeds in baskets. The change was so small that no one at the time could have recognized it as the beginning of something monumental. But with each generation, the shift grew. The land began to shape people as much as people shaped the land. And in that quiet turning, the golden age of human mobility and resilience started to slip away. What would replace it was a way of life that offered more food but less freedom, more people but less health, more complexity but more vulnerability. Humanity was stepping unknowingly into the first stage of
The shift that led humanity out of its long golden age did not begin with a dramatic invention or a sudden decision. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a temptation so subtle that no one living at the time could have recognized it as a turning point. In a handful of regions, especially the Levant, around what is now Israel, Jordan, Syria, and southern Turkey, people known today as the Natufians discovered something unusual in their environment. Certain valleys, plateaus, and river edges were rich with stands of wild cereals, wild barley, wild einkorn, wild emmer. These plants grew thickly, ripened predictably, and offered abundant calories with relatively little gathering effort. Instead of following the broad seasonal circuit of hunting and gathering, as their ancestors had always done, the Natufians began lingering. They stayed in one region through longer stretches of the year, returning repeatedly to the same patches of wild grain. At first, this was nothing more than convenience. Why wander widely when one area offered so much? Why abandon a place rich with food only to search for it elsewhere? It was a small, reasonable choice, so small that no one could have imagined it would reshape the destiny of humanity. As they stayed longer, their shelters changed. What had once been temporary structures of brush and hide began to take on more durable forms. Walls became slightly thicker. Foundations became slightly deeper. Hearths remained in the same place year after year. People stored seeds and nuts in pits, baskets, and bags. A subtle pattern was emerging, the beginnings of sedentism, a lifestyle built on returning to the same landscape repeatedly. Sedentism does not sound revolutionary, but it was. It tethered people to place. It shifted the balance between mobility and permanence, between flexibility and rootedness. It encouraged the development of objects too heavy to carry long distances, grinding stones, large vessels, thicker shelters, more elaborate hearths. All of these changes came slowly, each generation nudging the next toward a more settled way of living. This prolonged presence in one area brought a profound shift in the relationship between humans and plants. When people gathered wild cereals, they unintentionally selected for certain plant traits without realizing it. Normally, wild cereals drop their seeds easily once they ripen, a trait called shattering, allowing the seeds to scatter and grow into new plants. But humans preferred plants that held on to their seeds longer, because such plants were easier to harvest. Each season, the Natufians harvested mostly from plants with the least shattering. Each year, they unintentionally transported and stored seeds that stayed attached to the stalk. When these seeds were dropped near camps or thrown into discarded refuse, they sprouted into new plants around human settlements. Over generations, this process, the unconscious selection of non-shattering varieties, began altering the genetics of wild cereals. Plants that would never have survived in nature without human intervention flourished near human camps. Humans were not yet farmers. They were merely gatherers who selected the traits of future crops without recognizing what they were doing. This unintentional domestication was one of the most important developments in human history, but at the time it appeared simply as the natural abundance of familiar places. Sedentism also created new rhythms in human life. Mobility once ensured that populations stayed low and pregnancy spacing remained wide. Women carrying infants could not care for multiple small children of similar ages. But in a settled lifestyle, the physical burden of movement decreased.
Food storage increased. Energy intake rose. As a result, birth spacing narrowed. Populations grew. More children survived. The groups became larger, requiring more food to sustain their numbers. What had begun as a slight preference for convenience was slowly becoming a demographic trap. The more people a band had, the harder it became to return to a purely mobile lifestyle. Larger groups were less flexible, more demanding, and more dependent on stable food sources. This was another lock tightening, without anyone noticing. As population grew, so did the complexity of daily life. More mouths to feed meant more pressure on the wild grain patches. People began actively managing the growth of these plants, pulling up competing weeds, clearing debris, even scattering seeds harvested the year before. These were not yet farmers by intent, but they were performing the first small tasks that farmers perform, encouraging certain plants to grow more abundantly than others. And as the landscape responded to their actions, people increasingly saw themselves not as wanderers passing through, but as a type of caretaker or partner in the cycle of local abundance. Sedentism also reshaped social life in ways no one could have anticipated. Permanent or semi-permanent dwellings anchored communities. Social interactions became more continuous, more structured. Rituals became tied to specific locations, burial sites, stone circles, communal meeting areas. Storytelling and tradition began to reflect a world that was no longer infinite and open, but centered around a few known and revisited places. This shift created stronger local identities. Instead of thinking of themselves only as members of a band, people began identifying themselves with a territory, a valley, a mountain slope rich with grain. This emotional attachment to place created a powerful psychological change, a reluctance to move away even when conditions worsened. And slowly, cracks began to appear in the once stable world of the hunter-gatherer. Sedentism brought pests, rodents, insects, and parasites that thrived in stored seeds and in settled structures. It brought sanitation challenges. Waste accumulated faster than it could be scattered by movement. It attracted predators and scavengers that learned where humans would be. It began exposing people to new pathogens shared with rodents and early commensal animals like dogs. Yet the benefits of staying still felt immediate. Familiar landscapes, abundant grain, reduced daily travel, safer conditions for children and elders. The costs were slow, invisible at first. And the most important cost of all was this. Once a community became too large and too invested in local abundance, mobility, humanity's greatest survival strategy for hundreds of thousands of years, became harder to reclaim. The Natufians were not trapped yet, but they had stepped onto the path that would lead toward entrapment. Every year they remained in one place, their population grew a little more. Their shelters became a little sturdier. Their relationship with local plants deepened a little further. In staying put, they changed the land, and in changing the land, they changed themselves. By the time true farming arrived, the psychological, demographic, and ecological foundations were already laid. Sedentism was the threshold. Once crossed, humanity would never fully return to the old world of pure mobility and lightness. What happened next would be more transformative still. The conscious cultivation of plants, the birth of real agriculture, and the irreversible shift.
The shift from sedentism to true domestication was not a single moment of insight or invention, but a long, gradual drift driven by countless small decisions, none of which seemed important at the time. No one woke up one morning and decided to become a farmer. No one planned to alter the genetics of plants or bind future generations to a life of labor. Instead, early humans, especially in regions like the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia, interacted with the landscape in ways that slowly transformed wild species into domesticated ones and transformed human societies in return. This chapter is the story of how plants began to domesticate us as much as we domesticated them, long before anyone understood what was happening. When communities stayed in one place for longer periods, they harvested wild cereals more intensively. Wild wheat and barley have a natural mechanism called shattering. Once seeds ripen, they fall from the head and scatter on the ground, allowing new plants to sprout without assistance. For a wild plant, this is advantageous, but for humans gathering grain, shattering is inconvenient. The most desirable plants for harvesting are those whose seeds remain attached even when ripe, because they can be collected with less effort. Without understanding the genetics behind it, people harvested primarily from the least shattering plants. When they gathered stalks and beat them to extract seeds, the very act of collection favored non-shattering varieties. And when they carried these seeds back to their camps, stored them, dropped them, spilled them, and eventually scattered unwanted debris around their settlements, they created microenvironments where the seeds of these less wild plants could germinate. In this way, early communities unintentionally cultivated the earliest domesticated grains. The process was slow but steady, occurring over hundreds of years. Each season, humans removed seeds from the wild population, reducing natural regeneration and increasing artificial regeneration near settlements. Plants adapted to human behavior began to thrive near people. Over generations, these changes accumulated into genetically distinct domesticated varieties, plants that relied on humans for survival because they no longer shed their seeds independently. This was a turning point, not just for the plants, but for humanity. Domesticated cereals produced larger seeds, thicker stalks, and more calories per area than their wild ancestors. But the cost was dependence. Wild cereals grow with resilience in varied environments. Domesticated cereals thrive only under human care. Humans, in turn, began to depend on these new plants because they were abundant, predictable, and increasingly entrenched in their seasonal routines. The relationship became symbiotic. Humans shaped the plants, and the plants shaped human societies. As domesticated cereals became more common, people began performing deliberate actions that pushed them further toward farming. They cleared competing vegetation. They burned patches of land to encourage new growth. They watered young plants during dry periods. They scattered seeds intentionally, sometimes from specific piles of stored grain. These actions, though small, were fundamentally different from simple gathering. They represented a growing willingness to influence plant growth to secure future abundance. And as people relied more on certain plants, their seasonal movements narrowed further. Sedentary communities grew, and because they now had more dependable access to food in a concentrated area, population increased. With more mouths to feed, people intensified their interaction with desirable plants even more. It was a feedback loop of mutual dependence. More domestication encouraged more sedentation, and more sedentation encouraged more domestication. The consequences of this shift were profound and immediate in biological terms. The human body evolved over hundreds of thousands of years for a lifestyle of mobility, varied diet, and flexible labor. Suddenly, people were grinding grain daily, repeating identical motions for hours. Tools that had once been lightweight and portable became heavy and fixed in place. Grinding stones, mortars, pestles, large ceramic containers, clay ovens. These changes led to physical stress on joints, vertebrae, and teeth. Tooth enamel began to wear down from stone particles mixed into flour during grinding. Diets narrowed to high carbohydrate cereals, leading to increased cavities and nutritional deficiencies. The clearer archaeological evidence of these declines appears in skeletal remains, shorter stature, weaker bones, anemia indicators, and higher rates of childhood malnutrition. But despite these costs, the benefits of newly domesticated plants, predictable calories, and larger populations seemed to outweigh the drawbacks. Another subtle force accelerated domestication: social identity. For mobile hunter-gatherers, identity was tied to movement, to the land as a whole, and to shared knowledge of vast territories. But as early humans returned repeatedly to the same region and relied increasingly on the plants growing there, identity shifted toward place. People began associating themselves with a particular valley, a field, a riverbank. They maintained burial grounds that anchored them emotionally to local landscapes, making permanent settlement even more compelling. Domesticated plants reinforced this identity. Fields near settlements became culturally meaningful spaces, and tending them, however informally, became a part of community life. Over time, rituals began forming around plants: harvest ceremonies, communal meals, offerings to local spirits or ancestors. These rituals strengthened the psychological bond between humans and the cultivated landscape. What had once been wild became sacred, familiar, and central to group identity. Another force accelerating domestication was social identity. For mobile hunter-gatherers, identity was tied to movement, to the land as a whole, and to shared knowledge of vast territories. But as early humans returned repeatedly to the same region and relied increasingly on the plants growing there, identity shifted toward place. People began associating themselves with a particular valley, a field, a riverbank. They maintained burial grounds that anchored them emotionally to local landscapes, making permanent settlement even more compelling. Domesticated plants reinforced this identity. Fields near settlements became culturally meaningful spaces, and tending them, however informally, became a part of community life. Over time, rituals began forming around plants: harvest ceremonies, communal meals, offerings to local spirits or ancestors. These rituals strengthened the psychological bond between humans and the cultivated landscape. What had once been wild became sacred, familiar, and central to group identity. Another factor pushing domestication forward was competition. As populations in sedentary communities grew, they needed more resources to sustain themselves. Groups began expanding their managed patches of plants, encroaching on territories used by neighboring mobile bands. Conflicts arose not over land in the abstract, but over specific high-value stands of grain and over the territories where newly domesticated cereals thrived. For the first time in human history, people began defending plant-producing land as a resource worth protecting. This behavior would have been unimaginable in a purely mobile, wild foraging world. Territory had always been fluid. Now it began to crystallize. Land that produced high-calorie plants became strategic assets. These early tensions foreshadowed the far more violent conflicts that would emerge once agriculture matured. Another key development during this period was the domestication of animals, which happened in parallel. Dogs had long been human companions, but now sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs began to integrate into human settlements. Like plants, these early domestic animals thrived near human dwellings, attracted by discarded food, protected from predators, and increasingly dependent on the human environment. When people protected, fed, and selectively bred the more docile animals, domestication accelerated. Animals and plants together created a new ecological zone around human settlements, a zone shaped by human behavior and shaping human behavior in return. Domestication also began altering gender roles. Hunter-gatherer societies shared labor relatively evenly, but the demands of plant cultivation, grinding, and processing disproportionately fell on women. The repetitive, physically taxing nature of these tasks left clear marks on female skeletons: spinal stress, knee strain, and excessive tooth wear. This gendered division of labor foreshadowed deeper inequalities that would later define agricultural societies. By the time people finally realized they were planting and tending domesticated crops intentionally, much of the transformation had already occurred. The plants had changed, the land had changed, human bodies had changed, social structures had changed. What had begun as accidental domestication had become full commitment. And with every passing generation, returning to a fully mobile lifestyle became less feasible. The trap had not yet closed completely, but its design was already unmistakable.
The transformation from hunter-gatherer freedom to agricultural dependence did not happen suddenly. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly across generations. Each small shift seemed reasonable in the moment, yet together they formed a one-way path, a tightening trap that no community could escape once they stepped too far into it. This chapter explains how incremental decisions created a system that locked humanity into farming long before anyone realized what had happened. As early communities became increasingly sedentary, the first major change was demographic. Mobility naturally limits population growth. Mothers cannot easily carry multiple young children over long distances, so birth spacing remains wide. But once people stayed in one place, even part of the year, birth spacing narrowed. Sedentary life reduced the physical strain of child-rearing. Food became more accessible, and women's bodies recovered faster between pregnancies. Children survived at higher rates because they were not exposed to the dangers of constant movement. Within a few generations, even small communities doubled or tripled in size. At first, this felt like success. More children surviving meant stronger families, more hands to help gather food, more members to support the group. But larger populations required more calories. Wild resources were no longer sufficient to feed so many people within a small area. What had been an abundant landscape for a band of 30 was not abundant enough for a community of 200. This pressure pushed people to intensify their interaction with the plants around them. They weeded growing areas, watered young plants, expanded cleared zones, and gradually shifted from passive reliance on wild abundance to active cultivation. Population growth made farming not just useful, but necessary. And once a community depended on cultivated plants for survival, returning to hunting and gathering was almost impossible because the landscape could not support their increased numbers. The next major pressure was the accumulation of tools and structures that tied people physically to place. Hunter-gatherers used portable, multi-purpose tools designed for mobility. Sedentary communities, however, build heavy grinding stones, large ceramic vessels, permanent hearths, pits for storing food, and increasingly solid houses. These items signaled investment, psychological, physical, and generational. Once people built infrastructure, they became less willing to leave it behind. Houses were repaired and improved year after year. Storage systems grew larger. Grinding stones required enormous labor to produce and could not be carried on long journeys. These changes meant that every generation was more rooted than the last. Alongside population and physical investment came nutritional deterioration. Early agricultural diets centered around a few cereal crops, wheat, barley, millet, which lacked the diversity of wild diets. Hunter-gatherers consumed hundreds of plant species, seasonal fruits, nuts, tubers, seafood, and wild game. The shift to cereal-heavy diets caused dental decay, vitamin deficiencies, anemia, stunted growth, and weaker immune systems. Archaeological evidence shows that early farmers were shorter, physically weaker, and suffered more disease than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Yet despite these obvious hardships, communities did not abandon agriculture because the alternative had already become impossible. Too many people depended on cultivated fields for calories. Even if they recognized the health decline, they could not sustain themselves with foraging alone. This was another turn of the trap's ratchet. Reduced health made people more dependent on predictable food sources, which in turn made them more dependent on farming. The trap tightened further with the emergence of property. In a mobile society, property barely exists because nothing can be owned in a lasting way. But once communities settled, land became meaningful. Fields that produced abundant grain were valuable. Storage pits full of food represented wealth. Houses became personal spaces tied to specific families. The idea of ownership emerged, gradually, first informally and later formally. With ownership came conflict. When one family controlled a fertile patch of land, others desired access to it. When a household accumulated more stored food than another, resentment arose. Scarcity seasons heightened tensions.
In a hunter-gatherer world, scarcity could be solved by moving. In a sedentary world, moving was not an option. People were anchored to their fields and stores. Conflict became a permanent feature of human relations. Another tightening force was labor specialization. In small bands, everyone performs similar tasks and knowledge is widely shared. But in communities with hundreds of people, specialization appears naturally. Some individuals became better at crafting tools, others at managing grain storage, others at making pottery or tending crops. These specialists depended on agricultural surplus for food. Their roles, in turn, increased efficiency and productivity, reinforcing the agricultural system. Once specialization appeared, the system became more complex and more difficult to dismantle. A society could not simply return to foraging without losing the specialists who maintained tools, structures, and communal organization. Specialization also laid the foundations for inequality. Those who controlled food storage or productive land gained power. Those whose labor produced surplus for others had less autonomy. Hierarchies formed subtly at first, elders directing certain work, families inheriting valuable fields, but over time these structures hardened. Sedentism created both wealth and poverty, both privilege and subservience, long before formal kings or states existed. Another subtle but powerful pressure came from emotional ties to place. Sedentary communities developed burial grounds where generations of ancestors were laid to rest. These places created deep psychological roots. Leaving the land meant leaving ancestors behind. Rituals tied to specific locations reinforced attachment. Seasons became linked to agricultural cycles rather than broad migratory movements. Children grew up knowing the same valley, the same river bend, the same fields their parents and grandparents worked. Mobility was no longer part of cultural memory. This emotional attachment further locked communities into sedentism. Even during bad harvests or environmental fluctuations, people were reluctant to abandon ancestral lands. The trap deepened with environmental degradation. Farming required clearing land, removing trees, and altering water flows. These changes created erosion, nutrient depletion, and reduced biodiversity. As local environments deteriorated, people were forced to cultivate even more intensively to compensate. Ironically, the more they farmed, the more they exhausted the land and the more dependent they became on farming techniques to maintain productivity. Hunter-gatherers would have simply moved to healthier areas, but sedentary communities could not. They were tied to their infrastructure, fields, and population size. The landscape itself became part of the trap. Finally, social expectations cemented the transformation. Children born into sedentary societies grew up with farming as the norm. Few remembered the old ways of mobility. Skills essential for hunting and gathering diminished. Knowledge of distant terrains faded. Cultural stories shifted to focus on land, crops, seasons, and ancestral fields. Farming became not just an economic system, but an identity. By the time agriculture became fully intentional, everyone alive had inherited a world in which mobility was not just impractical, but unthinkable. The Neolithic trap was not a single mechanism, but a convergence of many forces: population dynamics, psychological ties, physical investments, nutritional dependence, specialization, conflict, and environmental shifts. Each generation moved a little further into a system that constrained their options more tightly than the last. By the time people recognized the costs of farming, disease, hard labor, inequality, and conflict, they had lost the ability to return to the life their ancestors once lived with ease. The trap had not yet closed completely, but the spring was coiling, the momentum building, and the path forward narrowing. The next phase, a global climatic disaster, would push humanity even deeper into the agricultural commitment and transform the...
Just as early agricultural societies were becoming increasingly dependent on cultivated plants and semi-sedentary living, nature delivered a blow that nearly ended the agricultural experiment before it truly began.
Around 8,200 years ago, a dramatic climatic event shook the world with a severity unmatched in thousands of years. Known today as the 8.2 kiloyear event, it brought rapid global cooling, extreme drought, and ecological collapse across vast regions. To the people living at that time, communities still experimenting with a fragile new form of subsistence, the disaster was catastrophic. And yet, paradoxically, it was also the crisis that forced agriculture to become stronger, more sophisticated, and ultimately irreversible. The trigger for this global disaster was a massive outburst of glacial meltwater from the remnants of the North American ice sheet. As the last ice age ended, a huge freshwater lake, Lake Agassiz-Ojibwe, was trapped behind ice dams. When those dams finally collapsed, trillions of gallons of cold fresh water poured into the North Atlantic in a short span of time. This sudden influx altered oceanic circulation, weakening the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system that helps regulate global climate. The result was a severe and abrupt cooling that lasted almost 2 centuries. For early farmers, this meant immediate and devastating consequences. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, regions where domesticated wheat and barley had begun to take hold, experienced prolonged drought. Rivers shrank, seasonal rains failed, natural vegetation withered. For hunting and gathering societies, climate change was disruptive but not existential. Their mobility allowed them to relocate, adjust their diet, and rely on diverse resources across wide territories. But for early farming communities who had already begun investing in domesticated plants and permanent dwellings, the situation was dire. Fields failed repeatedly, crops withered under intense dryness, stored grain ran out, livestock died from lack of water and forage. Entire communities tied to specific landscapes suddenly faced starvation. Archaeological evidence shows widespread site abandonment during this period. Settlements that had been occupied for centuries were suddenly left empty. Storage pits once filled with harvested grain were found unused, suggesting repeated crop failures. In some regions, skeletal remains show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and increased mortality. The 8.2K event revealed with brutal clarity the vulnerability of early agriculture. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had survived climate fluctuations through mobility, dietary diversity, and flexible social networks. Now they were tied to land, dependent on a narrow range of crops, and burdened with population sizes larger than wild ecosystems could support. In many ways, the drought exposed the risk of the agricultural gamble. People had traded resilience for productivity, diversity for predictability, and mobility for permanence. Yet, even as some communities collapsed, others adapted. And in doing so, they reshaped the future of human history. The drought forced innovation. Groups that survived did so not by abandoning agriculture, but by modifying it. The first major shift was toward irrigation. Before the drought, irrigation had been minimal and opportunistic, relying mostly on natural floods. But severe dryness forced communities to engineer canals, ditches, and water channels intentionally. They captured rainfall, diverted streams, and stored water in ways that were unprecedented. This marked one of the earliest large-scale human attempts to reshape the environment through technology. Irrigation dramatically increased productivity when it worked, but it also required cooperation, planning, labor specialization, and social coordination, all of which strengthened sedentary life. The second adaptation was diversification. Early farmers began cultivating a broader array of crops, not only cereals, but legumes such as lentils and chickpeas, and later flax for oil and fiber.
These plants had different water needs and grew in different seasons, reducing the risk of total crop failure. Mixed subsistence strategies also became more common. Communities intensified fishing, trapping small animals, collecting nuts, and resuming limited seasonal foraging to supplement failed harvests. In effect, they began making agriculture behave more like hunting and gathering, diversified, flexible, and reliant on multiple strategies. This hybrid model increased resilience and prevented total collapse. The third adaptation was storage. Long-term storage techniques improved dramatically during this period. People built larger grain pits, experimented with clay-lined silos, and developed better methods of drying and preserving food. Storage became central to survival. Communities that stored enough grain could withstand poor harvests. Those that didn't starved. This led to the first signs of controlled resource management, proto-administration, which later evolved into organized economic systems. The fourth adaptation was social. Communities that were once loosely connected became more integrated. Trade networks expanded, allowing groups to exchange resources across long distances. Regions suffering drought received food, tools, or animals from more fortunate areas. This increased interdependence strengthened cultural exchange and technological diffusion. Through these interconnected systems, the surviving communities developed a more robust agricultural framework. But the drought brought another, deeper transformation. It made agriculture feel non-negotiable. Before the crisis, agriculture was experimental, a supplement to wild foods. After the crisis, it became essential. Population sizes were now too large for a return to foraging. Knowledge of full mobility had already begun to fade. Landscapes had been altered by human activity, reducing the availability of wild resources. Agriculture was no longer an option, it was a requirement for survival. The climate disaster thus transformed agriculture from a fragile innovation into a necessity. Communities that mastered irrigation and diversification thrived in the recovery period. Those that did not disappeared. The memory of the drought became a generational scar, a warning that unpredictable nature required human control, planning, and stored surplus to endure. This fear and experience shaped the cultural mindset of the Neolithic world. After the climate stabilized, agriculture expanded faster and more extensively than before. Within the few centuries, new settlements emerged, larger and more complex than earlier ones. Crop yields improved, herding became more widespread. People invested more heavily in permanent architecture. The systems developed during the drought, irrigation, storage, diversification, and cooperation, became foundational to agricultural life. What nearly killed agriculture had forced it to evolve into a stronger, more sophisticated system. Yet this strengthening came at a cost. The tools and structures developed to survive the drought, irrigation canals, large storage pits, and coordinated labor, deepened dependence on farming and accelerated the formation of inequality, hierarchy, and conflict. The trap had snapped tighter. Humanity had emerged from the drought alive, but more entangled than ever in the agricultural web. The climate crisis had not stopped the agricultural revolution. It had ensured it could never be.
When the 8.2 kiloyear event struck, early agricultural societies stood at a crossroads between collapse and transformation. The drought was long, severe, and relentless, stretching across generations. It killed crops, dried rivers, scattered populations, and exposed the weaknesses of a subsistence strategy still in its infancy. But within this adversity, the foundations of a new, more resilient agricultural world were forged. The communities that managed to endure did so by rethinking everything they believed about food, land, labor, and survival. They innovated not because they sought progress or envisioned the future of civilization, but because survival demanded it. Their innovations, born from desperation, shaped the trajectory of human history. The first and perhaps most transformative innovation was irrigation.
Before the drought, the relationship between early farmers and water was mostly passive. Communities settled near rivers, relying on seasonal floods to nourish their crops. But the sudden drying of the climate shattered this reliable rhythm. Rain cycles broke, floods became weak or non-existent. Fields that once yielded abundant grain turned to dust. If food was to be grown, humans would have to bring water to the plants instead of waiting for nature to do it. This realization triggered one of humanity's earliest engineering revolutions. People began digging channels to divert water from rivers and streams. They deepened canals, carved out ditches, and constructed simple barriers to hold or redirect flow. The earliest irrigation systems were crude by modern standards, but they represented a profound shift in thinking. Instead of living in harmony with natural cycles, humans began reshaping the land to meet their needs. Irrigation did more than save crops. It increased food production beyond what nature alone could provide, allowing surpluses even in difficult years. It required coordinated labor, encouraging social organization and cooperation among households. It also established a precedent that would dominate human societies for millennia. Those who controlled water controlled survival. The second major innovation was diversification. Early farmers quickly learned that reliance on a single crop was a recipe for famine. If wheat failed, barley might survive. If barley withered, lentils or chickpeas could still grow. Legumes restored nitrogen to the soil and provided protein that cereal-heavy diets lacked. People began planting multiple crops intentionally to spread risk. Communities also broadened their subsistence beyond fields. They intensified fishing in rivers and marshes. They hunted small animals more frequently. They gathered nuts, fruits, and wild greens when crops failed. They returned to some of the practices of their hunter-gatherer ancestors, blending them with farming to create a hybrid system that was far more resilient. This diversification was not just ecological, it was cultural. Traditions emerged around multiple harvests. New culinary practices developed. Knowledge of plant cycles deepened. People learned to read the land with a more complex understanding, seeking microclimates and varied soils to ensure at least some crops would succeed. The third innovation was storage technology. Before the drought, storage had been useful but not essential. Now it became a matter of life and death. Communities began building larger pits, some lined with clay to keep out moisture and pests. Clay jars were fired thicker, tighter, and more carefully sealed. People learned to dry grains more thoroughly to prevent mold. They smoked meat, dried fish, and developed new ways to preserve nuts and fruits. Storage allowed communities to smooth out the harsh cycles of scarcity. One good year could sustain them for 2 or 3 bad ones. This shifted the entire way societies related to time. Instead of living season to season, they began thinking in terms of years and even decades. Planning became a cultural skill. Conservatism, holding back rather than consuming, became a survival virtue. This change in mentality laid the groundwork for the later emergence of organized institutions capable of managing surplus. The fourth innovation was mobility, not in the old hunter-gatherer sense, but in a modified, strategic form. Early agricultural communities relearned a lesson their ancestors had known for millennia. Movement can save a life. Some groups practiced small-scale seasonal mobility, moving livestock to where grazing remained possible. Others relocated parts of their population temporarily to areas where wild foods were still available. A few abandoned their settlements entirely and later returned when conditions improved. This semi-mobile strategy prevented total collapse. It allowed social networks to stay intact even as environments shifted. It preserved older knowledge that might otherwise have been forgotten forever. And it gave communities flexibility to survive in landscapes undergoing rapid ecological change. The fifth innovation was the strengthening of trade networks. When local crops failed, people sought help from neighboring regions. Communities exchanged food, tools, animals, seeds, and information across greater distances than before. This interdependence allowed societies in the driest regions to survive because others helped buffer their losses.
Trade encouraged cultural exchange and technological diffusion. Irrigation techniques spread from one valley to another. New seed varieties moved across regions. The idea of planting legumes alongside cereals diffused quickly. Over time, these exchanges laid the foundations for expansive networks that would later support long-distance trade and eventually international economies. The sixth innovation was social cooperation. Crisis forced communities to work together more closely than ever before. Irrigation required coordinated labor, digging, maintaining, cleaning sediment, and organizing water distribution. Storage required shared effort to build and protect structures. Mobility and trade required trust, alliances, and shared knowledge. People formed stronger social bonds, more formal leadership structures, and clearer rules governing land, water, and labor. Even though inequality had not yet taken its full shape, the seeds of hierarchy began here. Because someone had to organize the work, someone had to manage water, someone had to distribute the stored grain. Even if leadership was temporary or informal, it marked the beginning of authority beyond simple expertise. At the same time, mythologies and rituals evolved to help societies cope with uncertainty. People performed ceremonies to invoke rain, protect crops, or honor the spirits of rivers and fields. These rituals reinforced community unity and helped psychologically manage the fear of scarcity. They also strengthened ties to place, reinforcing sedentism even during difficult years. Finally, the seventh innovation was resilience itself, the psychological shift that transformed hardship into adaptation. For the first time, humans faced a crisis in which survival required not movement, but ingenuity. The communities that endured learned to anticipate failure, plan for hardship, and prepare for unpredictability. These behaviors, repeated across generations, became core cultural values. And when the drought finally ended, these newly strengthened agricultural societies emerged far more capable, organized, and technologically advanced than before. The 8.2 kiloyear event did not destroy agriculture, it refined it. It forced communities to develop the tools, irrigation, storage, diversification, trade, cooperation that would become the backbone of the agricultural world. In surviving the crisis, they created a system that was stronger, more complex, and far more deeply rooted. And with these innovations, the trap tightened even further. Once people adapted so effectively to crisis through agriculture, leaving agriculture.
When the Great Drought finally loosened its grip and the world's climate stabilized, the communities that had survived were no longer the same as those that had entered the crisis centuries earlier. They had irrigation systems, diversified crops, improved storage, strengthened trade networks, and newfound social coordination. These innovations became the foundation upon which a new cultural horizon emerged in southern Mesopotamia, an era known today as the Ubaid period. This period, beginning roughly 7,500 years ago, marked one of the most significant transformations in human history. It was during the Ubaid era that agriculture became not just a survival strategy, but a fully developed system capable of supporting complex, hierarchical, and increasingly urban communities. The Ubaid world was not yet the world of cities, kings, or writing, but it was the world that made all of those things possible. Its influence would echo through millennia, shaping the rise of civilization across the Fertile Crescent. The most defining feature of the Ubaid period was the scale of its settlements. Earlier Neolithic villages were small and scattered, often housing a few dozen families. But Ubaid settlements expanded dramatically. Some grew to populations of several hundred, others reached into the thousands. These were no longer temporary or lightly anchored villages. They were early towns with clearly organized layouts, communal buildings, and infrastructure that required coordinated labor. Excavations of Ubaid sites reveal substantial architecture, large rectangular houses built with mud brick, often consisting of multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards. These houses were not the simple dwellings of earlier eras. They reflected growing social complexity.
Some were larger and more elaborate than others, suggesting early forms of wealth differentiation. Yet the most notable architectural shift was the emergence of public buildings, constructed on elevated platforms. These buildings, often interpreted as early temples or administrative centers, marked the first material expression of organized communal authority. Their presence demonstrates that Ubaid societies had begun forming institutions that oversaw community affairs, such as grain storage, irrigation management, ritual activity, and perhaps dispute resolution. This was a profound change in human social life. For hundreds of thousands of years, leadership had been temporary and situational. In the Ubaid world, leadership began to solidify into recognizable roles embedded in permanent structures. This did not yet mean kings or centralized states, but it meant leadership, and by extension, inequality, was taking root. Burial practices reinforced this picture. While earlier egalitarian communities buried their dead with few goods, Ubaid cemeteries showed differentiation. Some graves contained pottery, tools, ornaments, and symbolic items, while others contain almost nothing. The presence of grave goods indicates not just inequality during life, but also social recognition of status after death. This suggests that social hierarchy had become an accepted part of the cultural fabric. Yet, despite these early inequalities, the Ubaid world did not exhibit the extreme stratifications seen in later Bronze Age civilizations. Power was emerging, but not yet absolute. Wealth existed, but it did not yet dominate every aspect of life. Instead, Ubaid society balanced growing hierarchy with strong communal traditions. Another hallmark of the Ubaid world was its mastery of irrigation agriculture. The drought had taught early farmers hard lessons about water scarcity and environmental fragility. In response, Ubaid communities engineered large-scale canal networks capable of distributing water across wide areas. These canals were not small household ditches. They were massive communal constructions, requiring coordinated labor, planning, and long-term maintenance. The presence of such canals shows that Ubaid societies had developed a level of organization far beyond earlier agricultural groups. Irrigation allowed fields to expand dramatically, leading to higher yields and more reliable harvests. This agricultural surplus supported larger populations, specialized labor, and the growth of permanent institutions. Just as importantly, Ubaid farmers had learned how to manage irrigation sustainably, at least for a time. They varied crops, rotated fields, and monitored water levels to reduce salinization, the buildup of salts that would later devastate Mesopotamian agriculture. The practices were sophisticated, intentional, and grounded in deep ecological knowledge. The Ubaid period also saw the emergence of a diversified economy. While farming remained central, people supplemented it with fishing, herding, and hunting. Rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates provided abundant fish, while marshlands supported rich ecosystems of birds and aquatic plants. Communities raised sheep, goats, and cattle, integrating animal husbandry into their agricultural lifestyle. This diversity made Ubaid communities far more resilient than early farmers had been. If one resource failed, others could compensate. This multi-resource economy allowed population expansion without immediate risk of collapse. Another major development during the Ubaid period was the expansion of long-distance trade. Archaeologists had found obsidian, turquoise, and other exotic materials in Ubaid sites, items that originated hundreds of miles away. This indicates that Ubaid communities were part of broad regional exchange networks. These networks spread not only goods, but ideas. Pottery styles, architectural techniques, agricultural strategies, and ritual practices. Cultural diffusion accelerated dramatically during this era, linking distant communities into a shared developmental trajectory. Pottery from the Ubaid period also reflects this growing complexity. Ubaid ceramics were mass-produced, beautifully painted, and stylistically uniform across large regions. The uniformity suggests shared cultural identity and possibly centralized production in some areas. Mass production implies specialization. potters who dedicated most of their time to their craft instead of farming. Specialization in turn implies surplus. Enough food was produced for craftspeople to focus on non-agricultural work. Together, these patterns reveal a society transitioning from simple villages to complex proto-urban centers. The Ubaid world also saw the beginnings of a new relationship between people and religious authority. Temples, still modest compared to later ziggurats, served as a communal center for ritual, redistribution, and administration. Priests or religious leaders likely oversaw offerings, seasonal ceremonies, and grain storage, weaving ritual practice into the daily economic life of the community. Religion became institutionalized, not just a personal or family experience. This shift gave religious leaders social power and paved the way for later temple economies that dominated Mesopotamian city-states. Despite their achievements, Ubaid communities were not invulnerable. Environmental pressures remained. Irrigation required constant maintenance. Canals silted up. Fields salted over time. Population growth strained resources. Yet the innovations and social systems developed during this era were strong enough to sustain growth and stability for more than 2,000 years. The Ubaid period represents a critical turning point in human history. It was the first time large, semi-urban settlements, institutional authorities, complex irrigation systems, social differentiation, and regional cultural unity emerged together. The processes that began in this era would ultimately lead to the birth of the world's first true cities, Uruk, Eridu, and with them writing, kingship, monumental architecture, and full-fledged civilization. In the Ubaid world, the agricultural experiment not only survived, but flourished. The trap of agriculture had tightened, but now it was transforming into an engine of growth, innovation, and cultural complexity. Humanity had stepped onto a new road, one that would lead inevitably towards cities.
In the long tapestry of human existence, few forces have reshaped society as profoundly as the emergence of surplus. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in a world where surplus was nearly impossible. Hunter-gatherers consumed what they collected, shared meat immediately because it spoiled quickly, and carried only what could be transported easily. The natural limits of mobility and perishability kept wealth equal and prevented long-term accumulation. But once agriculture matured, especially during and after the Ubaid period, this balance shifted in ways few early communities could have anticipated. Surplus food, created by irrigation agriculture and larger fields, became the spark that ignited inequality, power structures, and social hierarchies that would eventually dominate the human world. Surplus may seem like a purely positive thing. After all, extra food means security, stability, and opportunity. But in practice, the ability to produce more than one immediately needs marks the first moment when wealth can accumulate unevenly. In farming communities, the quantity of harvested grain varied from household to household. Some families had more fertile land, better access to water, more laborers, or simply greater luck. These families filled their storage bins to the top. Others, struggling with poorer soil or smaller plots, barely grew enough to survive. Over time, these differences in harvest size created differences in power. When